Well, good afternoon, everyone. I have to confess that this is the third attempt on my part to give this lecture. 2 years ago I offered to do it and was away on holiday and the car broke down on the way back. I missed it. Last year I offered to do it and we crashed the car in Lyon in France on the way back and I missed that. So this time we've kept it well away from holidays and I've managed to get here. The idea is to look at Oxford and to try and explain it insofar as it can be explained by looking at its history. Because I always think that with institutions, as with people, if you know something of their background, you then begin to understand them that little bit better. So that's the purpose of this session. And I'm going to do it in what I hope will be a fairly light-hearted way, which will amuse as well as convey information. And I always start by saying to people that if we were gathered today in this room to create the University of Oxford, whatever we came up with would look nothing like the present-day university, because no one in their right minds would set up a university like this. It's just what happens over a very long period of time. Let's face it, none of us is going to look quite the same in another 900 years' time. And it's the same with institutions, that they do change. So the sort of opening slide, so to speak, is Oxford now. This is what we're familiar with. What I'm going to do in a moment is go right back and show how we've come to this point. It does look good, doesn't it, from that height? You can't see the traffic, you can't see the tourists and so on. It's the very much the televisual image of the city. But the immediate impression you get, or at least I hope you get, is of course that this is not a campus university. It is a 38 campus university. So there's the first oddity. And when I show visitors around Oxford, I find invariably the first question they ask is, what is the difference between the colleges and the university? What's the relationship between? They can't understand it, not surprisingly. And I find the best way of explaining it is actually to use the analogy of the United States. Now, I know we have one American here. Do we have any others? Only the one. Okay. Catherine will know what I'm talking about when I say that if you think federal, then you can begin to get a grasp of Oxford. Americans find this much easier than we Brits do, because you do federal. You're brought up with federal. You have a federal system. In the United States, you have 50 separate independent organizations, the states. They are responsible for running their own affairs. There is also a central federal authority, the federal government, and the two are quite separate, and they have their own areas of responsibility. And they argue with each other about who should do what, but they are nevertheless perceived to be separate. Think of Oxford as being a little bit like that. Here we have 38 separate independent organisations, the colleges, like the states. We also have a central federal authority, which is the university. And they argue with each other about who should do what, but nevertheless they are separate with their own areas of responsibility. And I find that there's a way of trying to get a handle on it to begin with. That works for people. So what I need to do now, of course, is explain how we've come to this point, which means going right back very briefly to the origins of universities, certainly in the Western world. Do we have any Italians in the room? Oh, what a shame, because you get the bragging rights if you're Italians, because it's usually acknowledged that the first university to emerge in the Western world is Bologna, which is underway by 1088. Needless to say, early universities are not following a system. There is no system. They're making it up as they go along. What's happening is that Europe, at any rate, is becoming re-urbanized. And with the growth of new towns beginning in Italy, what you get always in towns are professions. And professions need what we would call continuing professional development. So students developed a system in Bologna. It's the start of breaking away from the cathedral and monastic schools and providing a secular education. And the system they devised is one that I'm prepared to tell you about, providing you will promise to keep it in this room and not tell anybody else. There's got to be a deal, you see. Is this a deal? Okay. The reason I say that is because the Bologna system was a university run by the students. There's some in the room who might like this, but most of us probably don't. So the students form themselves into associations, and they decide what courses they need. And they hire and fire the faculty to provide the courses they need. And it's one way of running a university. Another model emerged courtesy of the University of Paris, which is the second university to emerge. And that was a university which was organised and run by the teaching masters, not by the students. So they decided policy. And Oxford, when it appeared, possibly the third to appear, is on the Paris model. Oxford very much on the Paris model. Whatever Paris had, Oxford had to have, because that's the model it was copying. So Oxford was another university where the decisions were made by the teaching masters, meeting together in a body called congregation. And interestingly, of course, we still have that body called congregation. It's there right at the start, and it's still there. And so far as I know, people can correct me, but as far as I know, Oxford and Cambridge are the only two universities which still retain that system, where the final policy-making body is the teaching masters and the senior administrators of the university. In most universities, faculty, let us say, can put pressure on the hierarchy, but it's the hierarchy, the president, whatever, body of trustees who decide policy. Here, any policy proposed by the Vice-Chancellor can be overturned by congregation, and one or two have been. So it's a very different, it's there in Oxford because it's there in Paris. One thing to bear in mind, that in none of these early institutions is there very much in the way of government involvement. These are free enterprise institutions. There's no such thing as an academic career. There's no such thing as an academic salary structure. Basically, as a teacher, you get paid if students turn up to your lectures and pay fees. It's very much payment by results. There's all sorts of things that we, as academics, would not at all approve of. One reason, just going back very briefly, Bologna, one reason why it was a student-driven university was because Bologna was predominant in the teaching and study of law. And its students were predominantly lawyers. That is to say, people who were already in careers. And you begin to see why they would want to set up and influence an organisation of their own. And you see that, I think, with this rather nice early image of the Bologna students, mature, thoughtful individuals, in stark contrast to this sort of caricature, self-portrait of an Oxford student, I'm sorry to say, an image, this on the manuscript in the Bodleian Library, 15th century manuscript. So this was done at the time and depicts an Oxford student. By the 15th century, if this guy is going to get a degree, and I have to say it's not looking very likely, he's going to have to spend 5 years to obtain a bachelor's degree. The gold standard is the master's degree, the MA. Still is, I suppose, but it certainly was. And that takes up to 7 years of study. What these students are basically is apprentices. And they are serving an apprenticeship just as other young people do in society at that time. So If you want to set up in trade, the only way you can do so is by being the son of a free man or becoming an apprenticeship and achieving the freedom, so to speak. So that if you want to be a mercer, goldsmith, shoemaker, brewer, baker, whatever it is, you have to serve your 6 or 7 years apprenticeship. At the end of that period, you present your masterpiece, and you are then declared a master baker, brewer, candlestick maker, whatever it is, and only at that point can you put your name up and trade under your own name. Think of the students as much the same. They are serving 7-year apprenticeship. At the end of that period, they will produce their masterpiece. They will then be declared Masters of Arts. And only then may they teach. That's their trade, so they can then teach. But, as I just said, there is no academic profession, so to speak. Only a tiny handful actually stay on and make their careers at a university. You know, the Roger Bacons, basically, of this world. The general pattern is that when you have achieved your master's degree, you stay on at the university as a teacher for 4 or 5 years, and then you move out and make a career. Almost nobody makes a career within the university. What that means, if you think about it, is that the average age of people within the university was very much lower than it is today. Because students were about the same age as they are now. Teachers, however, are leaving, let's say, in their late 20s. So it means the average age of the whole body is probably in the low 20s. Don't know what it is now, probably in the 40s or something, I think. I just don't know. But it's going to be a lot older. So it is a very different sort of institution. It's much more open than it is today, in that if you can persuade the university authorities that you have the basic knowledge, you've acquired the grammar and logic and so on, to begin, if you can persuade them that you can cope with the Latin of the lectures, then you're pretty much in. Another big difference, I can't be certain about this, but it's possible that as much as 50% of the student body did not proceed to a degree. If you think about it, 5 or 7 years, there's no help here. You've got to find your own finances for 5 or 7 years. That's very tough now, let alone then. And it seems possible that up to 50% didn't proceed to a degree. And this is something we need to be aware of. It's a way they thought differently from us. We immediately begin to think failure rates. And no institution with a 50% failure rate would survive very long today, I wouldn't have thought. They thought differently. They thought it was better to go to university and take some courses than not to go and take none. It's a different way of looking at it. It's another way in which it is a totally different world. Something else I could point out, the way it's different, is the way people lived in Oxford at that time. What you've got to bear in mind is that the university grew up in a town which was very much older than it. Oxford was a well-established, fairly prominent town in Oxford. It was a major centre for commerce and industry, administration, and law courts met here as well. And the university then grows up. It comes small and insignificant into this flourishing town. And in a way, the story of the first 400 years or so of the university is a story of a shift from that pattern of a university growing up as a minor element in a prosperous commercial centre. There is a shift to an Oxford that becomes a university town that also does marketing. Do you see that shift? So that it's there today. Oxford is known very, very widely around the world. It is known almost entirely as a university town. I mean, quick test. How many people in this room know that the BMW Mini car is made in Oxford? More in this room. Only about half, interestingly. In most audiences I would speak to, it might only be 1 or 2. The point being that it is still an industrial and commercial centre, but people know it as the university town. So the university comes in late, it comes in small, and it gradually takes over and becomes the dominant partner. And in fact, if you speak to people in the town, they very often will say something like, all was well in Oxford till the university arrived, and it's been downhill ever since. It's just a different way of looking at it. So these students coming into Oxford, they're not coming to live in colleges. There are no colleges. The first colleges don't emerge for probably 150 years after the university's been underway. So students are actually living out in town. And just to give you one example of what's typical, I don't know if you know this building here. This is High Street. This is King Edward Street going down to Oriel Square, just to locate you. This used to be Oddbins, but now isn't, and I've forgotten what it is. Sorry? Sweaty Betty's. Thank you. That's fashion. An unfortunate name, but it's a fashion shop, isn't it? And this is A-Plan Insurance, so that's the one. Okay, so we've got it marked as medieval housing. Now, you will be saying to me, but hold on a minute, that clearly is a building of about 1800. You were saying that, of course you were, yes. Plain stucco front and so on. But the nice thing about a lot of houses in Oxford is they're very much older at the back than the front, because if people have money to spend, they tend to spend it on the front, doing it up, where it'll be seen. And if you go to the back of that house, what you find is this. So the back is 500 years older than the front, which is very convenient for me, because this is one of the few houses left in Oxford that we know, it's documented, this is a house used by students. This is typical student accommodation. Numbers we're unsure of, 1,300, let's say maybe 1,500 students in Oxford. As I say, not living in colleges. There are 3 or 4 colleges in existence by this date, but they don't take undergraduates. They are tiny institutions for the support of a president or whatever, a head of the college, plus a handful of fellows and maybe 1 or 2 graduate students, certainly no undergraduate students. The undergrads are all living out in town in establishments like this. So these 1,500 students are scattered in little groups of 10 or 12 in a building like this. The pattern is that a teaching master will rent this house. He will sublet rooms to students who come and stay with him in that house. He will give them classes, they will pay him fees, and so on. And this is the basic unit within the university. And it's one reason why there is so much trouble in the early days of the university. If you think about it, what you've got is 1,500 young, energetic, high-spirited, more or less out-of-control young men wandering the streets of Oxford and getting into trouble. All medieval towns were violent places. Oxford was notorious even by the standards of the age. There were multiple riots. The greatest of them all, possibly have heard of it, the St. Scholastica's Day riot of 1355 left 62 people dead. Now, this is serious stuff. It's not just a scuffle in the street, it's pitched battles. And the next slide I'm going to show you, and it's the one you really must pay most attention to, because this is what you're going to be examined on at the end of the session. This is the settlement of one of these disputes. It's a settlement of 1214. It's the oldest document in the university archives. Not very impressive. It's not remotely as big as it looks on screen. It's about that sort of size. And has always, despite not looking that impressive, has always been carefully preserved by the university because it sets out university privileges. And this is what happens. The basic pattern when there's a dispute is that the town wins the fight and the university wins the peace that follows. The university, in the final analysis, will always have the backing of the Crown and the Church. That is to say, government in all shapes and forms, because government needs an endless supply of young bureaucrats coming through, and that's what Oxford and later Cambridge will provide. So the general pattern is that after each dispute, the university gets more and more privileges, which is how eventually it ends up as the dominant partner. And you find this beginning to be set out here. So you find various universities. It's felt that the university needs to be better organised if it's to be protected and to survive. So it is given an organisation. The basic university organisation derives from disputes with the town. And it gets given a chancellor or a vice chancellor. It gets 2 disciplinary officers. There's got to be some discipline within the student body. 2 disciplinary officers are appointed, proctors, an assessor. They're all here and they're still with us. It's the basic paraphernalia. And enshrined in this document and successive documents are the university's privileges, and the town is compelled to agree to uphold the university privileges. And in the case of this particular document, it was ordered that when the new mayor, each year when the new mayor of Oxford was elected, the first thing he had to do was go in a procession to the university church and swear an oath to uphold the university's privileges. And that continued, would you believe it, until 1858. The town was forced to swear an annual oath to uphold the university's privileges. So you get the sense of the university rising to dominance. Now, I want to say something quickly about the rise of colleges, because this is so important. I'm just going to look at one, New College. Not because it's the earliest, which it wasn't by any means. It was new in 1379 when it was founded, but there are already several colleges there. But this is significant for a number of reasons. First of all, its sheer size. It's difficult to convey this to you now because Oxford's full of these, and so it doesn't really register. But when it went up, it's the first on this scale, and it's enormous. Merton College, which is an earlier establishment, was already beginning to put up big buildings, but rather differently from this. Merton's big buildings are scattered. It has an early quadrangle, but it doesn't have everything the college needs within that quadrangle. The chapel isn't in it, the hall isn't in it, for instance. This takes all the elements that a college might need, chapel, hall, accommodation, teaching, library, and so on, and puts them into a quadrangle, which in origin is basically a monastic cloister. And as an architectural model, it just works. From now on, this is what a college will look like. This is the archetype. And they do. From now on, colleges for a long, long time will be on this model. Same happens at Cambridge. They pick up the model, do the same thing. They call them courts there, but it's the same thing. And it does work. It travels the world even. Think of the American Ivy League schools that are very often on this pattern. The other thing to point out about this college is that it is the first one that accepts undergraduates. That's a big breakthrough if you think about it. From now on, undergraduates can live in a college. Parents are much happier sending their sons to a place like this where they can be locked in and looked after and so on. You've basically got a much better chance of getting your son back in one piece if he can be locked up in a place like this rather than living out in town. And just before New College opens its doors, there are effectively no undergraduates living in college. By 1500, most undergraduates are living in college. There is a great shift into college. And what we're going to get is the age of the college. From now on, increasingly, Oxford will be run for the benefits of these colleges, which are growing in size and in number. What the colleges want is what Oxford will do. And you reach the point where every vice-chancellor of the university, until I've forgotten the date, is about 1990 when John Hooke came, every vice-chancellor will be the head of a college. And his body of advisors, hebdomadal board, will be largely made up of the heads of colleges. And what the colleges want is what the university will do. Another huge distinction between these new colleges and the university is represented by the college founders. in this case, you can make out that triptych of statues. There are 3 sets of these at this college. I've got a close-up. The college is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, who's in the tall niche in the centre. On her right, the Archangel Gabriel. On her left, the college founder, William of Wykeham, Bishop of Winchester. And it has been wittily observed that this tells you all you need to know about a medieval bishop's sense of his place in the cosmos, which is slightly below the Virgin Mary, but at least on a par with the Archangel Gabriel. So don't feel too sorry for this guy bankrupting himself, setting up this magnificent establishment. As Bishop of Winchester, he was in possession, so I've read, of the 2nd richest bishopric in Western Christendom after Milan. He was also the King's Chancellor, which meant he was head of government. And he was clerk of the King's Works, which meant he ran royal building campaigns, which included Windsor Castle at this time. He's exceptional, but most of these college founders, they are able, energetic, occasionally ruthless, highly efficient people who will rise to the top in any society at any time. These are people who do not believe in the separation of powers. They believe in the concentration of powers in themselves for preference. This is the sort of person who's standing behind a college. Nobody is standing behind the university. The university is founded by nobody. It just emerged. This college, on the day that it opens its doors, is immensely wealthier than the university. The university's got no money, basically. These colleges are set up with endowments and with the ability to go on getting wealthier. That's why, as I say, it's increasingly going to be a world dominated by the colleges. To use our American analogy again, it is as if the Confederacy had won the Civil War. Power, significant power vested in the states. So that's why I've called this slide of the Divinity School, which, as you know, now part of the Bodleian Library, set up for theology lectures. So I've called it The University Strikes Back. The university, in a quandary really, it decides it needs to have some magnificent buildings to show, it's saying to the world, don't forget the university, we're here as well as all these colleges. And because there's a danger that the colleges will take over totally. I mean, what the university always manages to cling on to is the awarding of degrees. Colleges have never been allowed to award degrees. And the university has to admit them, it examines them and so on. But otherwise, everything is being done, say, by and for the colleges. And here's the university putting up some magnificent buildings of its own. But the clue here is in the dates. The whole of New College is built in less than a decade. The university takes over 60 years to build one room. Okay, you can't go down to B&Q and come back with a room like this. I mean, it is quite magnificent. But there's the thing, the university doesn't have the money. It has to stop building, raise more money, continue building, and so on. And there, if you like, enshrined is the difference. Now, another theme, and I can't cover everything, I'm just picking out themes that I want to refer to, is a change that takes place within the university at the very top. And it's symbolised, if you like, by this gorgeous figure who is the Earl of Leicester, Queen Elizabeth's favourite, and who was the Chancellor of the university. He was the successor of another number of other grandees who were Chancellors of the university. This began in the mid-15th century, when the university decided that what it really needed was influence at the centre of power, influence at court, basically. So it began to appoint as Chancellor a grandee. Up to then, the Chancellor had been resident at Oxford and had been the CEO. But from the mid-15th century, what happens is the Chancellor becomes a grandee outside Oxford, and the executive authority devolves onto the Vice-Chancellor, which is what we still have, isn't it? I don't know if Chris Patten would want to be called a grandee, but he is actually. And it's the Vice-Chancellor who's effectively the CEO. This works to some extent. These people will do you favours, which is what's wanted. But you are entering a mafia-like world. They will do you favours, but at some point they will call those favours in, and woe betide you if you don't do as you're supposed to. So, I mean, this guy succeeded Cardinal Wolsey. Cardinal Wolsey needed the university's support in the matter of the King's divorce. The Earl of Leicester had a whole host of matters that he wanted the university's support for. This guy is the control freak's control freak. He intervened in everything. He even sets out what academic dress is to look like. You'd think he'd have other things to do, but he's involved in absolutely everything. And he's utterly ruthless. And he does not want to be dealing with congregation. He does not want a rabble of young teaching masters banging on his door. He wants to deal with a select few people who are very much like himself. And so he ensures that motions can only proceed from the university that have been approved by the Vice-Chancellor and the Hebdomadal Board. That's the Board of Advisors. So it's the university shift from being an open, democratic, somewhat anarchic institution to being an oligarchy, very much under the control of heads of houses and a handful of professors. And what you're getting for the first time is the university becoming an arm of the state. This is a big difference. It's becoming intimately linked in with government. Another theme I just want to mention is an expansion of the university that takes place in the 16th century, which is significant for a number of reasons. There is, of course, a dip in recruitment round about the Reformation because all the students that would have come from the religious houses are immediately removed as religious houses are suppressed. But that is then overtaken by an expansion of the university's 16th and then to the 17th century. There's an expansion because there's a new type of student coming. And that new type of student is the sons of the rich, who start to come for the first time. Up to now, the university has been made up of the middling ranks of society. If you're rich, you had a private education. If you're poor, you've got none. It's the middling ranks. But increasingly, they start to come in the sons of the gentry, effectively. Now, these young men are coming in to treat the universities essentially as finishing schools. It's part of being finished as a gentleman that you go to university and you take some courses. They're not necessarily doing the courses in order to acquire a degree. They don't need degrees. They don't need careers. They are already rich. And what's more, they rather look down on people who do need degrees and do need careers because they're going to have to sully their fingers with commerce. So they're coming to university and mixing with people who in other circumstances they would be directing to the back door of their houses. And this type, this sort of gentleman, the amateur gentleman of distinction, this is one definition of this type that grows up, becomes a type much looked up to within the universities. They come to dominate the universities. And what they're cultivating is this air of effortless superiority. You must succeed without appearing to try. That is the real mark of a gentleman. And on the back of that, there grows up the notion that professional training is for second-raters. If you're any good, you do it. It's the natural talent of these gentlemen to be able to do these things. Only second-raters need to be trained. It's an attitude that still clings, does it not, a little bit? Think of creative writing. Creative writing courses. And often the comment is, how can you be taught to be creative? which isn't the point of the course, but it's an attitude that clings. And it comes to dominate the universities. If you want, I spend all afternoon on this, but if you want this type, the epitome of this type that comes to dominate, think late 19th, early 20th century fiction. I mean, Sherlock Holmes would be a case in point. Best of all, but I don't know how many people read her anymore, would be Dorothy L. Sayers. Some people nodding, so a few of you know Dorothy L. Sayers. The hero of her novel, she wrote crime detection novels in what's sometimes called the golden age of detective fiction between the world wars. And her detective is a man called Lord Peter Wimsey. And there you have the type. He's an aristocrat. He's a distinguished alumnus of Balliol who got a first in modern history. He's just brilliant at everything he turns his hand to. He plays Bach perfectly. There's no evidence in any of the novels that I've read that he spends as much as 5 minutes practicing, but he nevertheless can sit down and play the well-tempered clavier from memory. He's a great collector of incunabula and so on. But this is the type. And in fiction, it's not an unattractive model. It's just no way to run a country. But it's somehow it's what we end up doing, because this contempt of professionalism, I can remember it when it was somehow disreputable to have professional training. It was the cult of gentlemanly endeavour, and certainly takes over civil service and so on. And Oxford Cambridge play a big role in this. The other shift with these people coming in is status, which you find in the hall at Christ Church, which is there, of course. And if you go into the hall, the question to ask is who in the 16th century has their meals in a room like this? The answer is Henry VIII does. Cardinal Wolsey, the founder of this college, does. And Oxford students. This is high status. They've come a long way from those little houses scattered through town to this. And I think even today with modern streetwise kids, it must be intimidating to sit down for your first meal in a room like this to produce 14 prime ministers and so on. There's John Locke, the great political philosopher. There's William Gladstone. Over your shoulder is Charles Dodgson. Over your left shoulder is William Penn, the great Quaker. Pretty intimidating. We've moved into a different world, and it's a class-conscious world now. This is the period in which Oxford and Cambridge begin to acquire their snob reputation. The earlier university has no snob value whatsoever. It's something that comes in now. Again, this air of effortless superiority which so gets up the noses of other people, and which the university is so anxious to shake off. Now, another point I want to make, and give you something to look at while I make it, the building to concentrate is the central one there, that you know is the Sheldonian Theatre, designed by Christopher Wren for university ceremonies in the 1660s. And incidentally, the first neoclassical building to go up for 200 years now. It will be all neoclassical. But it marks a point. That it's this period I just want to say a few words about in the mid-17th century. The general point I want to make is that no university, no human institution, come to think about it, is ever steady state. They always come and go, switch back, sometimes doing well, other times not so well, and this university fits that pattern. Mid-17th century, I would maintain, is a period when the university is doing exceptionally well, and it's a period it can look back on with some pride. And that's because the university plays an important role in the development of what we think of as modern experimental science. That is a shift, put it horribly crudely, from alchemy to sort of experimental science. And there are a number of significant figures working in Oxford in the 1650s in particular. Think of people that we've all heard of. Robert Boyle. Everybody at school has heard of Robert Boyle. There is Robert Boyle's his assistant, Robert Hooke. Very spooky looking character he is. Interestingly, there is no contemporary portrait of Hooke. This is a modern portrait put together on the basis of verbal descriptions of what he looked like. I don't know way of knowing how accurate. He looks a bit scary. But, I mean, science colleagues in the room will correct me, but talking to science colleagues, a lot of them now regard, although he was Boyle's assistant, they now regard Hooke as the more significant scientist of the two of them. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I do know that a few years ago I read Lisa Jardine's biography of Christopher Wren, and it dawned on me after a while that it was actually all about Robert Hooke. But it may be that you can't sell a book with Robert Hooke's name on it, but you can always sell a book with Christopher Wren's name on it. Anyway, be that as it may, he's hugely significant insofar as the general public know him now. It's for his pioneering use of microscopes for the study of organisms, as you find with his famous depiction of the flea, which is very well known from his micrographia. I mean, there are a lot of these people. Another one, just quickly, William Harvey, warden of Merton College, who's the man who demonstrates that the heart is a pump that circulates blood around the body. So this is all significant stuff that's going on. Christopher Wren himself, of course, never called himself an architect, as far as I know. He was a mathematician and an astronomer and a geometrician. What happens in the 1650s is that these scientists working in Oxford meet together regularly to discuss each other's work. And in doing this, they begin to draw up rules by which they will accept each other's work. It is no longer enough for somebody simply to assert that they have proved something. You've got to demonstrate it. You've got to demonstrate it to your peers. So, putting it as succinctly as I can, all the paraphernalia of modern experimental science are emerging at this time. In other places, I mean, not just Oxford, but it's just Oxford does play, I think, a significant role. And these figures who were working in Oxford in the 1650s at the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, many of them then pursue their careers in London, continue to meet in London, and there form the Royal Society. So the Royal Society has its origins in the meetings of these Oxford academics in the 1650s. But then, as if to prove my point about fluctuating fortunes of the university, it is almost as if the university falls off a cliff, in that the 18th century is generally regarded as academically the low point in the university's career. And there are a number of reasons for this. It's highly entertaining because the university has the misfortune to be at its low point at a time when some of the finest writers in the English language are at work and they begin to excoriate the university. You know, Edward Gibbon and figures like that, all criticising the university. And what they portray going on at Oxford is generally sort of erratic behaviour of this sort on the part of students, or it's the teachers of the university misbehaving and so on. And part of the problem is that the fellows, the college fellows, lose sight of the fact that they are in the education business. As college fellows, they are virtually in possession of freeholds. You can't get rid of them. And they are free to follow their own interests. And for most of them, their interests did not include teaching undergraduates. So as an undergraduate in many colleges, if you wanted a really good education, you had to hire a private tutor. You wouldn't get it from the college tutor. There are also big problems in religion and politics. In religion, as quickly as I can, in 1581 under Queen Elizabeth, an order was brought in that to obtain a place at Oxford or Cambridge, which means to get a university education, you have to swear an oath that you're a member of the Church of England. What that means, if you think about it, is that if you're a Catholic, Baptist, Quaker, Jewish, you cannot get into university. University doors are shut against you. You'd think that's really bad news for these people, but they do all right. They set up their own academies for young people. And if you think what's going to happen in this country is sort of commercial revolution, above all industrial revolution, religious nonconformists are very prominent in those movements and do all right. It's the universities that struggle because they turn in on themselves and become just inwardly focused, almost obsessed with religious matters, until by the end of the 18th century it's reckoned that Oxford really had only two products, sausages and parsons, were said to be the products to come out of Oxford. There's political trouble. There are, if you can recall, two attempted coups d'etat in this country in the 18th century, 1715, 1745, Jacobite rebellions. The university is implicated in both. In 1715, the university's chancellor, the Duke of Ormond, has to flee the country to avoid execution for treason. So what does the university do to demonstrate its loyalty? It appoints his brother instead. So the university's position is well known. And what that means, if you think about it, as a parent, is that if you send your son to Oxford, you are making a political statement. And it's quite a dangerous political statement. And fewer parents are prepared to do it. And you see that in the matriculation figures. In 1650, which I think is a high point, something like 400 new students every year come up. That's good for that time. 1700, it's down to about 300, and in 1750, there were only 182 new students. The place is dying. People are just not coming anymore. I mean, Jeremy Bentham, the great political philosopher, said that in his time at Oxford, the only useful thing he had learnt was how to play tennis. He then, of course, goes on to set up London University in the 1820s. And he sets it up to be as unlike Oxford as possible. In particular, he forbade the teaching of religion. It was to be a secular institution. You can still go and see the founder of London University in the entrance at University College. He's there, this sort of mummified, rather gruesome character, but that is Bentham. And London University was a huge success. And it's tempting to think that had Bentham lived 40 or 50 years earlier, when Oxford was at its lowest point, would Oxford have survived? We tend to assume that because things happen in a certain succession that they had to happen in that way, but they don't, of course. There could be alternatives. And this, well, I usually over-egg this period because it's such an entertaining period. And so I felt one ought to do something to redress the balance and say, that, there are significant figures at work in Oxford, like this guy, Halley, Edmund Halley's comet, but all those other things as well. He's a polymath. And I understand is the man who, to some extent, is responsible for the appearance of Isaac Newton's Principia. In this, the reason being, again, so I'm told, is that Newton was very reluctant. Michael, you could correct me here, but Newton, I understand, very reluctant to publish, and coming up with one excuse after another. And his final excuse was he couldn't afford it. At which point, Halley paid for it out of his own pocket. Newton had run out of excuses, and it duly appeared. So there are significant, but it's the generality that is the problem. This is counterintuitive, because as you wander around Oxford, there are lots of really magnificent buildings of this period, and you'll look at them and think, in your innocence, well, Oxford must be doing really well in the 18th century. Look at all these buildings it's putting up. Well, what it's telling you is that the money's coming in. It's just not going on education, it's going on buildings. So there's new university buildings, or just about every college rebuilds itself partly or totally in this period. Queen's College, 1675, about to begin a building campaign. Looking, you would think, more than big enough for the 20 or 30 people who'll be living there in the 18th century. But no, they knock it down and rebuild it as a palace. And of course, what they're doing, they're trying to attract back students who are not coming anymore. The message goes out, come to Oxford, the most comfortable society of any in Europe. And that's the message, come to Oxford and be comfortable. And it's not much of a battle cry, really. I mean, we're all happy to be comfortable, but really, as a student, you've got to go to where you get the best education. And it has to be said that in the 18th century, in the newly formed United Kingdom, if you want a top quality higher education, you do not go to England, you go to Scotland. Scotland very much on a roll. Scots would still say you should go today. But I mean, at least we can argue the case now, but it's very difficult for the 18th century. The failure of these building campaigns to draw back students who are not coming means the university at last realises that it must reform root and branch or go under. And really the story of the 19th and 20th centuries, which I'll conclude with, is a story of the dismantling of that old clerical society and its replacement by a university devoted to teaching and research. And going through some of it, it's unusual. It's things like this. What this is referring to is the fact that from 1877, and only from 1877, could the fellow of an Oxford college get married and keep the job. What it means is that until 1877, you cannot have an academic career and a family. Not officially, anyway. Religious tests were abolished in 1855. So until 1581 to 1855, religious tests. Then it becomes a secular university. More significantly, in a way, are the sort of institutional reforms that attempt to turn around the curriculum and so on, so that you get the Ashmolean Museum, incidentally the last great neoclassical building to go up. But it's more than there as a museum to house archaeological and art collections. It is a way of bringing together humanities teaching and research into one place. To create what I think economists might call a critical mass, where small elements interact and produce something that's greater than the sum of the parts. Of greater significance was this building, the Museum of Natural History, 1860, doing the same thing, bring together the scattered collections and teaching of science in Oxford into one place. Because it's realised that this country and Oxford is falling behind in a big way our two great rivals, that is the United States and Germany, in the teaching of science. And this is partly it's to remedy that. And you go in, and it is, of course, it's the materials of the railway age, iron and glass, being used for academic purposes. But what is startling, I think, to people today is that if you look at the environment of that building in 1860, very early photograph, there's nothing else there. It's on a greenfield site. And you look, you take a moment for your eyes to acclimatise to Google Maps, but just look at it. That is staggering, the difference. And that whole science area that you see here has spun out in a way from that museum. And it conveys, I think, very graphically the extent to which really science drives almost everything in Oxford these days. Science is the big drive. Science brings the big money in. And science is one of the main reasons why the university has re-emerged centre stage, having been pushed there by the colleges. Science is so expensive that it cannot be done satisfactorily college by college. You cannot have 38 particle accelerators. I don't know if there's 38 in the world, I don't know, but you can't. I mean, even a wealthy college could hardly afford a really decent chemistry laboratory. It has to be done across the university. So science undergraduates will get some of their teaching within college still, but they'll spend a lot of time up at the laboratories and lecture theatres in the science area, medical students up at the hospitals and so on. And that is supervised and organised and funded by the university rather than by the colleges, which has put them in powerful position. And another great reform of the age is the arrival at long last of women in Oxford, a mere 700 years after the university has been going. And I've called this thrilled to be at Oxford because they actually don't look very thrilled to be. They look a bit fed up, don't they? Having struggled so hard to get in, they don't look very pleased to be here. And people often say, oh, that's because in 1888 you have to sit still for 2 minutes because the cameras were so slow, which you didn't. They weren't that slow. If anybody's interested, it's because in 1888 photography saw itself as a branch of the high arts. So you sat for photographs if you're having your portrait painted. And if you look at her, today she would be listening to her phone while the cameraman's getting set up, but she's striking a pose for a portrait. And that is, oh no, I've forgotten the name. She's hugely significant. She's a significant figure in all sorts of ways, particularly for women's history. She's the woman who's a pioneer traveller explorer in Iraq. Gertrude Bell, thank you. That's Gertrude Bell, as an undergraduate, thank you. But, I mean, the point here is, it's sometimes said this is the generation that has won the battle they've got in, and I don't think that's really accurate. It's more accurate perhaps to say they've won a battle, perhaps most accurate of all, to say they've won the right to be on the battlefield, because we know with hindsight how many battles still lie ahead. These young women have done better than their brothers to get to university. In most families, what money they've got to spare will have gone on their brothers, not on them. They'll have been second best to their brothers to this point. So they've got in, they go through the curriculum, they sit their exams are graded, but they will not get degrees. Oxford didn't give its women students degrees until 1920. Cambridge was even worse. Cambridge didn't give women degrees until 1948. So these young women will be middle-aged before they can come and collect their degrees. Their contemporaries at Cambridge never will. They'll be dead. It's another 60 years on. And the reason why they couldn't is they weren't allowed to matriculate. They didn't sign the matriculation registers, so weren't fully members until 1920. So I went to the University Archives and looked at the registers for 1920 with the first women to sign, and there on the front page is Dorothy L. Sayers, come to collect her degree. But as I say, it's a start rather than an end of a process, and it's a process that we're very familiar with. But I must hurry on. Other ways in which the university has changed enormously is the extent to which it's become an international university, having until about 1900 been almost entirely a national institution. It has become international as the figures. I love that New Yorker cartoon. That is a Rhodes Scholar walking across, that clearly is Oriel College, but walking across the quadrangle, and the heavens open and the shaft of sunlight comes down to illuminate. But it's not only the students who are put up there. I believe that if you look at the origin of faculty at the universities, over 40% are from overseas as well. It very much is an international organisation. And another way in which it has changed is the extent to which it's becoming a postgraduate institution. Oxford did not award D.Phils really until after the First World War. It took the view that if anybody had anything interesting to say, why don't they write a book about it? What's the point of a doctorate? Sorry, anybody who's doing a doctorate. What's the point of a doctorate which will be read the most by an examiner and possibly the candidate's mother and nobody else? But that sort of lofty attitude crumbled under pressure, particularly from Germany and the United States, where postgraduate student studies were pioneered and developing very fast. And the university has become increasingly postgraduate. At the moment, I believe the figures are something like 60% undergraduate, 40% postgraduate, but the figures are moving together. And of course, one reason for that is that the university still loses money on every undergraduate it educates, but you don't lose money, or at least not as much, on postgraduates. And so we have the happy arrival of colleges like our own, and here you are rejoicing. We're playing a big role in this transformation. I mean, what is it now? 1,000 students here, postgraduate students. It's a big transformation. And postgraduate studies is an area of activity in which the university plays a big role, as well as the colleges. And the other reason why, another reason why the university has pushed forward to centre stage is, of course, government. Government has, since the Second World War, produced a succession of measures, countermeasures, revisions, and so on, policies, many of which have required the university to administer them, like research activity and so on. You see that quite dramatically, I think, in the university offices. Into the 1950s, the university registrar, who is the senior administrator of the university, the registrar had a staff of 40 to 50 people. The registrar now has a staff of 1,600 people. And if you read the Oxford magazine, the cry goes out from the colleges that university administration has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished. There's a loss. It is interesting. We've gone from the university worrying that it did not know if it would survive in the face of all-powerful colleges. We've now got colleges worrying if they can survive in the face of an all-powerful university. It's interesting how the world turns, is it not? And if I might just say something very, very briefly about how I see colleges, in a way I see them as a means of humanising a much bigger institution, because when you come to Oxford, certainly as an undergraduate, as you would realise, as an undergraduate you don't apply to the university, you apply to a college. If the college accepts you, you become a member of the university. It's different for you as postgraduate, you'll have applied to the university. What it means is that you are a member of two organisations, the college and the university. Using our American analogy, it's as if you're a Californian and an American. It's two. And I think the college sort of humanises the much bigger university. It provides that almost, if it goes well, it does work in an almost sort of family-like way, and accounts presumably for the fact that colleges, until the last couple of decades, colleges were always much more successful than the university in fundraising, because people felt that immediacy of belonging to the college rather than to the university. So that, just to give one example at random almost, when Rupert Murdoch gave Oxford a library, he didn't give it to the university, he gave it to his old college, Worcester College, and that would be fairly typical. But as you know, all students now have to belong to colleges. There is a big difference from the way the university started off, with no students belonging to colleges. The last slide I want to put up this afternoon is deliberately provocative. This is a university slide designed, I presume, to demonstrate the university's diversity. And published, unfortunately, just at the time when the political arguments were getting very hot in the newspapers and so on, pointing out that Oxford and Cambridge, above all, do not represent the demography of this country at all, and that something must be done about it, and so on. But I do it because it makes the point that it is never a steady state. There is always something that's going to come over the horizon that will need to be dealt with, and this is a big problem for the university, and obviously will continue to be a problem for some time for the future. But I would point out that Oxford, as you well know, features very highly in all international tables of the standing of world universities. It's there in the top group. I would ask you, what other human institutions you can think of that are still successful after 900 years of activity? The papacy? The monarchy in this country? You're beginning to run out of examples pretty rapidly. And I think that's a remarkable achievement, still to be different, but still going strong after, as I say, after 900 years. So I hope I've given you some idea, at least, of what it's been like over the past 900 years to live and work in this most delightful, if perverse of places, and that maybe if you didn't know before, you have a little better idea of why it is such an eccentric organisation today. It wasn't set up as such, it's just become that way. And if it's given you any idea about that, then it's been worthwhile. So thanks very much, everybody.